Hello, and thanks for joining us on our December user group. My name is Luke O'Keefe, and I'm Customer Success Manager here at Martello. I'm joined by Chris Millay, our Technical Support Manager, Justin Borchter, our Technical Sales Manager, and Andrea Easton, our Customer Success Manager. On today's user group, Justin and Chris will be taking you through hybrid cloud monitoring with IQ, how to see impact in your cloud services. Today's format will be as usual. Justin and Chris will do our presentation, and after we'll have a question and answer section. So with that, we will get started. I'm going to hand it over to Justin.
Hi Luke, thanks for that. Today we're going to be going through a couple of focuses, in particular for our solution, how IQ can allow you to see the impact in your cloud services or applications. And when you're using the hybrid cloud monitoring strategy as well, we will be discussing how IQ integrations for Amazon Web Services, Azure and Office 365 can combine to achieve this for you. If you at any time want to test this out for yourself, please reach out to Luke. You guys will have access to IQ and can get those integrations switched on to pull in the data, because we know this is a hot topic with a lot of customers who are looking at getting that monitored. We'll wrap up with a little bit of other news from emails that have gone out, and where just a focus on our current customers. So there's some information we definitely want to make sure you got up to speed, including our new mobiles approaches. And of course, the Q&A section that Luke mentioned. So let's get started. The cloud monitoring scenario today. So here's an example of what cloud monitoring can give you. A simple application that's available to you or to a user that approaches as a web page. So on the far left is how the web page should work today. And the scenario and problems that people run into and encounter that is that hosting these websites out onto Amazon Web Services, Google, or Azure basically takes away a lot of the infrastructure overheads you guys have to worry about. Spinning up a new server is not an issue, making sure it's available, and having that worry and concern taken away from the business is covered by a lot of these cloud groups. However, when a user gets to the web page and gets a 404 or 500 or some issue like that, potentially something's gone wrong in that application today, and that might be more than a configuration problem. If that application, for example, on the next slide, you'll get to see that application can be made up of lots of different components, potentially a front end, which is more than just one web page server. It could be a clustered up IIS farm, a middle part, which is sitting in the cloud, the application components, Elastic, Amazon Web Service servers, Azure, MySQL, NoSQL servers, computers that support that, of course, network devices in between, firewalls that block, the unwanteds to get to the ability, and potentially some components that are still on-prem for a lot of these applications as well. That could also be more databases, more Windows services, but potentially more computers and the infrastructure that's from there. So you can see this gets a bit complex. I mean, this is a very simple component, but if something starts to go wrong, like for example, that Elasticsearch web page goes wrong and other components start failing, that can rapidly pour into a problem for the end users. And that can be combined with a lot of other scenarios that run there as well. So you could be getting performance issues coming in. You could be getting network devices telling you they're slowing down. Your front end could be not visible to particular users. And unfortunately, when I go to a lot of other customers I talk to and a lot of people around the world, they tend to come back to me with, well, this is a very important scenario, but how do we keep this under control? And the question I go is, well, how do you measure it today? And there's lots of conversations of SLAs and how cloud takes away that SLA, the availability of the component, but that doesn't take away the conversation around what should you be measuring as SLA, which is delivery of the service. So in this case, as you can see the scenario, lots of components fall out. One of the components on the front end has failed, but the web page still runs. So technically the application is running. So the IT people are still fighting fires, making sure everything's running, but nothing on this scenario that's happened today has failed miserably enough within the service to keep it running. So users still have access to the application. Now that's what you want to show the management. Now, how do you show that when all of these different components live in different parts of the world, different clouds, different locations, and potentially have different monitoring tools that look at them? Again, on the next slide, you guys are going to be inundated with information flown out from on-prem, from a monitoring perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, even from the end user perspective. So for those of you who have ITSM solutions like ServiceNow out there, or potentially your business has invested in APM testing like AppDynamics or Splunk or Dynatrace, there's a lot of data around that application that is designed to help users understand if it's running effectively. Now, what we're doing with our solution in IQ, Martello's IQ solution, is we build a layer that groups all of that data together. so that users don't have to jump in between Azure, Cloud, ServiceNow, SCOM, on-prem tools, and future tools. Basically, that means if you move your workloads out and you get other companies to run the applications for you, keeping an eye on them becomes easy and useful if it's in one screen. And that's where a lot of our Live Maps users, if you haven't already invested in time in doing your service mapping, I'd recommend looking at Live Map service maps, which help you understand system operations managers' limitations when it comes to full-blown service monitoring. But also with Live Maps, you can align your objects with an operations manager into a service map. And then essentially, as you move stuff into the cloud or into other tools, you can plug and play those into your service maps using IQ, which has the ability to elevate that service map to understand things like tickets from ServiceNow, or virtual machines or workloads coming from Azure, or a simple application monitor coming from Azure Insights today. Hey, Chris, welcome on board.
The interesting part about this is obviously with IQ, we have multiple different types of integrations, and that's kind of what we're talking about today. And I figured we'd start by going through some slides, and slides are highly important in this case, of the different types of integrations that we have and what specifically do we pull from those. So obviously we'll start with Azure, always a good one to start with for us anyway, being Microsoft centric. So for us, there's Azure and then Azure Insights. And we're actually going to cover both of those. We'll cover, Amazon Web Services. We'll go through those real quick. But for Azure, it's as simple as retrieving, the virtual machines, the sites, the databases. We're basing our health based on state property, whether it's online, whether the website's running, the VM is started, then it's considered healthy. If it's not started, then it's considered critical. That's been helpful for a lot of people who spin up and shut down VMs on a regular basis. They can see which ones are up and running and are not on a pretty easy basis, whether those things are in boards or whether they're in services as we've deployed Azure itself. So Azure Insights is obviously a bit different in the fact that we retrieve the configurations and the relationships to your subscriptions based on the tenants. We also receive your resource groups with their health states. With those, we're looking at the components, the application insight, the application virtual machine. So there's a little bit of an overlay when it comes to Azure Insights or Azure monitoring and just plain up Azure. It depends on whether you actually have Insights up and running, whether you're actually doing any kind of rules and testing along those lines. So that kind of determines which one is probably a little bit better for you. We actually pull a lot more property values when it comes to Azure itself on the VMs, whether the state is running versus just Azure Insights, which is actually looking more of the rules that you've set up and the applications to figure out whether things are going or not. So there's a slight difference there, and it really comes down to the properties and things that Microsoft exposes on each side for us to actually look at. So that's kind of one of the differences there. You're able to try out both of them at the same time to figure out which one is a better suited for you. And so for some people, they use both. So it's really kind of up to the individuals.
Sorry, Chris, it might be worthwhile mentioning as well that the Azure integration, that pulls a health state against the computer based on what you've set up on your Azure thresholds on the CPU and stuff. The Azure integration, you notice, doesn't actually generate an alert because that's where Microsoft's leaning on Azure monitoring if you want to get alert notifications to come out of there. So Azure monitoring is hidden within Azure Insights. Azure Insights is a few different things. So you can do application monitoring, synthetic transaction monitoring, and they're adding more daily. However, that's a major feature difference. So if you imagine, for those of you used to SCOM, Azure, when you run up a virtual machine, will give you a computer, where Azure Insights will give you a threshold or a monitor against that computer, like you want to see the disk not go above a certain percentage, and you can run that out. We mention that because a lot of people, when you go into Azure Portal, and Microsoft is changing the story regularly on this one, hopefully they'll settle down, but it's a very simple click through in the portal, right? So running a VM up or a machine up is Azure, and then getting monitoring against it is Azure monitoring. Getting informed potentially that machine hasn't got enough resources or is struggling or is even security breached, which is a monitor as well. That comes from a different API. That's useful enough for a lot of people to see that. If you haven't tried out Azure, go in and play around with it. I've been doing it to prepare for this. It's very simple to jump into the monitoring and switch it on. One of the things I did notice, which was a huge scenario for this one, is that you'll get different resource groups and different subscriptions running up in Azure. And then Azure Monitor doesn't care about where it sits. It can look at any subscription, any resource group. So you can flow alerts through it. So that works very effective with a single portal. And the only thing right now is the choices you have is you've probably got a monitoring platform in place, being your SCOM, trying to get those notifications to flow through SCOM, and then enable you to piggyback into the Azure portal so that, if it tells you there's a problem, getting to the root cause and being able to fix it. Scrum can't do a giant leap with you at the moment, and that's where we come in, which we'll get to show you just now. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
So another key component of the cloud is obviously Office 365. With Office 365, we're actually going to pull the services, the service features, the health states of those. How we base the health state is based on, service degradation and interruptions are obviously considered critical. If it's operational, then it's healthy. If it's restored or there's just information available, we consider it healthy. We've gone through some trial and error on this one since Office 365 is technically not a monitor or a monitoring tool. We based it off of its health states and what it's considered, and actually gone through some improvements with our own customers as what they felt things needed to be to help us line these up. We also pull the relationships between the services and the features, and then any of the alerts for the messages or the incidents that are created are actually shown up as alerts within our tool. And then as they close those out, we obviously close them out on our side too. So you only see only the active ones, or well, you can still see the closed ones, but you're able to see those that are new and active. It's just nice to be able to put components from Office 365, especially when you're talking about those hybrid setups where you have Exchange on-prem, you have Exchange in the cloud. Being able to see both sides of the house is extremely valuable.
It's a little bit more than nice, right? That is a scenario that you guys are measured off on. And when we start talking about SLA deliveries, that's where it gets really difficult, right? Do you just measure Azure on its SLA of availability of the infrastructure? Or, your application, to go back to my initial slide there, still requires pieces to run on-prem as well.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the customers I run into struggle with an SLA report that potentially they have to grab from multiple data sources, and not just the real-time view, which is also incredibly important to make sure it's running. As you mentioned, we will pull the alerts from Office 365, so we'll give you a real-time view of what Microsoft is telling you are problems, which is helpful in trying to resolve issues or not. But reducing the amount of time it takes you to deliver an SLA report of services that are spread like that is a goal for us. So you're going to start seeing that come in on some of the features we'll show you as well.
Okay, AWS. AWS is another key component. We find that a lot of people have their cloud is either in AWS, it could be in Azure, and we find that some people actually have both. We actually have both in our operations, depending on what service we're doing. So things are on multiple sides nowadays. So when it comes to what we pull, I'm not going to go through this entire list and read it one for one, but we actually have a lot more when it comes to AWS as far as pulling in, your clusters, your Elasticsearch, load balancer. One of the key ones that I wanted to highlight that we added recently is the Route 53, the DNS web service, web check. One side is what we pull, and one side is pretty much is kind of what we get the health state. So there's a lot that we actually pull from AWS. Luckily, they expose a lot through the API of what we can grab and pull in. So pulling in this information and seeing it in your services is extremely helpful.
Yeah, we run across a lot of Amazon Web Service users that do struggle in getting this data next to other tools, because Amazon Web Services doesn't really deploy in on-prem for a lot of people. So moving workloads into here is great, but this is really where a high availability system comes in, right? And they don't have a monitoring platform to speak of that can do that hybrid scenario. So you do get left with a lot of data that is very helpful to you, but how do you connect the dots, right? So if the Elastic cluster or the load balancer goes out, what's the impact to the service, and can users still get to the other parts of the service that gives them a little bit of an experience? And that's where making sense of all of this data, the more data you get, the more important that becomes.
Mm-hmm. Especially when you're talking about the different sides of the house, when you're talking about the stuff that's in the cloud and the stuff that's on-prem, trying to figure out exactly what's going on, where my problems are as you go through. All right, so that's enough of the slideshow for right now. Let's go into the lab. Okay, so for those who haven't seen IQ, this is IQ. I'm going to go through a couple things real quick. I'm not going to go through, obviously, a full-fledged demo of IQ, but what I did want to go into first is start talking about the different integrations that we have. So integrations for us, it's a matter of connecting to a monitoring tool, a matter of connecting to an ITSM. We do have some action types, which include dealing with something like DIRDAC, or it could be PowerShell or just email, those things that are more of a notification type of action That's why we call them an action integration versus a data type. Here's a list of what we currently have, with the exception, I will say that Google Cloud is currently not available, but it is coming. The rest of these are already ready to go, except for the Mitel one is also another one that's up and coming. So Azure, Amazon Web Services, Azure Insights, that's kind of the main focus today. Setup for these is pretty simple on our end. For the most part, we're asking for, things like a tenant ID, a subscription ID, the client secret. How you get this information, we have set up. It's not actually in the install guide. The reason for that is kind of simple. For each of these cloud-based services, they have a habit of changing themselves. I'm pretty sure that everyone who's actually used Azure has logged on and all of a sudden realized, oh, they've done another update. The portal's completely different than it was yesterday. And because of that, what we're doing is we're adding all the information to set those up in our knowledge base, because it's more likely to change on a regular basis than anything else. So if you come to the knowledge base, that's support.martellotech.com, you can go to knowledge base articles. We're adding stuff through our entire Martello Tech line, whether it deals with IT Ops, which is the IQ Live Map side, or it could be the Net Tech side, which is the Elfiq products, or it could even be Martello itself, or MPA. So in here on the How to IQ section, you can actually see exactly the setups of how we're needing to get the information to kind of walk you through. We'll need to get the service principal. We're going to need to get your tenant ID. We're going to need you to generate a secret key. From those, you can capture them, put them in here, and then once we have all that data, we'll start pulling it and putting it into IQ. Should be relatively simple. They do have a tendency, like I said, to change the process every so often. We've found that a few times where we've had to update the document, but the general flow has always been the same. So it's always going to need an application ID. It's always going to need a secret. It's always going to need a tenant ID. We'll try to help you out in getting this. If for some reason you're deploying this and it's changed on you, let us know. We'll try to help you out. And then obviously we need to know so we can make sure we update our documentation as soon as possible. Okay, that being said, component types. So most of these, when it comes to Azure itself, obviously we're going to know that those things are VMs. Same thing with AWS. So those are going to be labeled as a computer. However, most of your stuff is actually going to be in the component section. In here, I can actually go through and say, look, show me what I have from AWS. Show me what I have from Azure Insights. You can see I've got multiple subscriptions going when it comes to Azure and looking at those things. Office 365. So we pull in all this data to show you and give you an idea of searches. Now, any one of these you can actually click on. So like Skype for Business, I can actually look at it. I can look at the raw properties, how it's doing right now. If I need to, any one of these property values you can do searches on. So as an example, I actually have this, and I'm going to use this in a further demonstration, but I'm going to actually target certain websites in here. So if I do like source.azure.name, and I'm looking for certain parts or the type, in this case, Microsoft.website, that's actually a property value directly in, probably going to have to. So in here, I grabbed and instantly brought myself down into the 4 that I was looking for. I can actually come into the raw property values and see everywhere that it's kind of matched my search.
One thing to add, Chris, so just a step back, and once you've got the integration set up, and this is a key point that a lot of people bring up to me in the scenarios, because the way that on-prem monitoring done is a lot more controllable than stuff that happens in the cloud, right? So one of the key factors is, I did it again this afternoon. So if you look at Justin's Azure, I was just playing around with it a moment ago. I had one computer run up yesterday just to test the connection. And 5 minutes ago, I added another one, which is the Windows host. So they pour in automatically through the integrations as and when the integrations refresh against the target system. So once you set up an integration, you're going to get all the data flow in there. Now that also works for not just Azure, but anything we hook into. So Office 365, Chris, if you can do me a favor and go to groups and services and then just tailor that to Office 365. Yep. We're going to grab every single relationship or service that becomes available from Microsoft over the time period. So a good example of this is I was actually doing a proof of concept with a customer in Denmark, and they just released Kaizala, which is at the bottom there, which if you haven't tried it, it's a really cool sort of time-killing collaboration app that allows you to play games with everyone. You want to get it in before the business bans that, because it's actually great fun to play with. it popped into the service portal here straight away. So we don't have to rehook something up. We don't have to wait for an upgrade for something on-prem to suddenly be able to read that. We read live new releases through the API on that system, as long as the user account is scoped to see it. So if Microsoft doesn't change anything on permissions, then you guys will get that flow in there. So you can be guaranteed that this auto updates into this data source as well. So you're never behind. And that includes virtual machines and components, right? You just spin up a virtual server, and if it's in the same subscription we're hooked up to, it'll flow into the data. That's going to become important when Chris shows you how to build up a service map, because then you can actually align your, similar like live map, search strings to automatically grab new data as it flows in. So all of this, we're focusing on this and being real-time, updating real-time data flows. So there's no coding behind the integration. There's no retargeting components. There's no waiting for an upgrade from us or anything like that. It'll flow into the system.
And while we're here, I figured I might as well do this too. So, and this is really easy to show on this particular one on the SharePoint online. When you drill into an object, we'll always have this kind of more details button. This allows you to see the details for this particular object. For the most part, how long it's been up, when the last state change, we'll give you all of the raw property values for that particular object, and we're just grabbing the object from the monitoring tool, or in this case, Office 365. We'll also show you if there's any members. This one happens to have sub-members as part of the service that it's dealing with. So if I go into Explorer, this actually breaks that down even further to show you the relationship. So this is kind of cool when you start looking at it from some of your on-prem stuff, some of your off-prem stuff. You can actually build and look at, how the relationships tier down to each other. Also, you can go through any of the alerts. If it's on an incident or any boards or services, you can start to see where you've got this object if you have it put in any other locations. So I figured I'd show that real quick. However, to start building a service, so a service to us is the same thing as what it was in Live Maps. That concept still works. It's still about looking at the service as a whole, looking at your end user, your application, your infrastructure. Those are your main parts. But when you're talking about a hybrid service, those things are on different areas. It's nice to kind of be able to put the, here's all the on-prem stuff, here's all my virtual servers that are running in Azure or AWS. That's part of my infrastructure. But you may have to actually add your switch in there, because that's also part of your infrastructure. It could be a key component, whether things for the stuff that's in the cloud are actually working. When you talk about your applications, they could be on-prem websites or databases, so it's a matter of adding all of those components into this mix. To start a service is relatively easy. I'm going to actually go back into the home to kind of start one, and then I'll go back to the one that I've already started to create and start talking about it. So first off, I always find it easiest to start with infrastructure. That's just me. You could start with a database. It really doesn't matter in this case. So if I was to start one, let's say with Justin's Azure, these two in Azure could be part of the same service. So if I wanted to, I can click on one of them or both of them and highlight it. And at this point, you have the ability to come down here and pin. That's what we're considering it. You can pin this to a board, or you can pin this to a service. In this case, I'll go through the service just to kind of start that. And then I'll show you boards just so you can get the concept of that area also. Pinning it to a service, I have the option to choose any of the existing services and whether I want to put this into an end user, an application, or an infrastructure, or I can create a new service. Service can be, give it your name, give it your description. Obviously, I'm adding these components in. Where do I want to add them for? I'll add them into, the infrastructure. And when you start talking about a health roll-up, how does the health need to roll up for this particular service? Is it worst case? Is it best case? Is it best of a percentage? We follow kind of the same rules that SCOM have done. This gives me, an overall health roll-up. This can allow you to, if you got multiple objects in there, to turn around and say, look, I'm still green as long as 80% of the objects are still up and running, and that's fine with me. So it's completely up to you. And then after this, it's just a matter of hitting create. This will create the service for you, and then you can start adding other components. I'm going to pause at this point, at least for this particular service, and go back to the one that I've kind of already started to create, because I want to add components to that one. Go ahead.
Just keep in mind, as Chris mentioned, that our service overview follows the Live Maps model. So again, the best practices from Live Maps will flow into here. So infrastructure will be things like CPU disk usage, which you might notice from Azure Workspace is missing. So you'll get the virtual machine, which rolls up all of those components, to be honest. So those two virtual machines you put in there, that green health state is driven by the disk space and the CPU only. So it's actually a lot cleaner model than SCOM has, because SCOM used the management packs and then rolls all of their relationships to the host, which would be the VM. That's separated out in Azure, and that's actually a very cleanly way to look at it. So if you want some encouragement, Azure components should go in the infrastructure, and you can safely just put the VM in there. However, for your on-prem monitoring stuff on the computers, you still probably have to go through the exercise of separating out components that represent the actual server itself, like CPU, disk space, separate out from them.
And one more thing. So I'm creating this service manually, but if for those that actually have SCOM, one thing that's always possible for us to do is if I go into my groups and services and I bring this down into something like my actual Dallas SCOM, you'll notice that here's a service. I can scope this even further and say, look, I only want the list of services. If I highlight any one of these, then down here at the bottom, your pin option, you have an L for live maps. This will literally take the service that you've created in live maps and then port it over into IQ and bring all of the objects that you have over into your end user, your application, your infrastructure. It'll do that for you. So you don't have to think about it if you've already created it. And then the nice part about that is you can turn around and then augment that information and start adding in some of the other parts to it that may be in the cloud or at other locations. So you do have the options to start bringing stuff in from there. It's just really nice if you've already got it already set up. The other thing is we also do a discovery on this. So if you make changes in SCOM to a particular service, so in Live Maps itself, then we'll see those changes and bring those changes forward. So it isn't like you have to, once I've imported it once, then I always have to keep two things updated. You could pretty much work on SCOM on the live maps for the SCOM side, and then IQ you can work on to add components that are other than SCOM. You leave it all in IQ also, it doesn't really matter.
So that's a very classic scenario of a hybrid shift. So if you see your application owners slowly shifting components into Azure because they think it works faster or they'll have access to it, you're going to have that mix and match sort of approach where SCOM's monitoring it as a service, and potentially 2 or 3 servers have moved in, because they want the latest version of SQL to run on there. It's cheaper to get it through Azure. That's where applications are not geographically located, but less and less they're going to be spread out, where this scenario then allows you to have that hybrid scenario in there. But what you'll find is your infrastructure component, I actually find in a lot of customers, the network component stays pretty key. The load balancers or the switches or the network devices monitored by SolarWinds or PRTG, they're going to stay pretty pertinent to the conversation because they still are a way to measure or ensure from an infrastructure point of view that users can get from their workstation to the application components in Azure or their Office 365 components, right? That's why we invented this one, because SCOM only completes the picture a little bit, and still plugging in from the other tools completes that service map overview.
So our services look like this. You still have the service itself, the end user, the application infrastructure, supplier services, so you can relate services together. The supplier service, just like Live Maps, does not affect the overall health of your service as a whole. We do add and show you the number of alerts that are for that service, number of incidents, and then give you an uptime for the service over the last 7 days. It's a simple kind of layout. If for some reason you don't see these other columns, that is generally because of the browser itself maybe scrolled in, sometimes, yeah. So if you have a different zoom level on your browser, then sometimes you don't see those other parts. So I figured I would kind of explain that because I've caught myself a few times where I was like, where are my columns? And knowing that they should be there. Drilling in, it's still the members, which would be the end user, the application infrastructure. You can easily look at, all of the alerts for any of the members that are in here at any one time. The same thing for any of the incidents that are going to show up. Those are going to be the ones that are basically going to be from your ITSM tools when you've added those objects in there. Just going through end user, in this case, I have the one object. The label is not very friendly in this case, but looking at the property values, you'll notice that this one's actually a Route 53 check. Giving me just kind of how am I doing DNS to get to that particular object? In this case, a website. Let me go back here. Application. I added the SharePoint Online. I've got a couple databases that are in the cloud. I got a couple databases that are technically on-prem. The one thing I don't have in here is something like a website. I'm going to kind of go back to that search that I did and show you how you can add this as a rule. And then from there, you can turn around and actually add a dynamic rule to a service to add objects and populate them dynamically. So I'm going to go back and use that kind of that same search, that source, pulling in the direct property values that I'm looking for. By the way, well, I'll cover that in a moment on how you can get some of this information to figure out exactly what processes or what search terms to use. So if I click on this and I come back to my components and I look at my 4 components that I've pulled up from this search, I have the ability to save. I can save this as, I already did that at one point, because I did it yesterday when I was testing this. In this case, I really just need my components. If you leave it as all, you may not notice the save and add as rule, but if you bring it down to the components or computer, you'll get the option to add a rule. I'm going to go ahead and save and add this. Is asking me where I'd like to pin this rule. I'm going to pin it to a service, or do I want to pin it to a board? I'll go ahead and add it to a service. And then of course I have this selection of going ahead and either creating a new service or adding it to the one that I'm after. In this case, I'll add it to the application, which is exactly where I want it. So I've pinned that in there. I've got to give it a moment to actually pull the discovery in based on the rule. But if I come back into services overview, yesterday it was fairly quick. You'll notice I now have my websites that are in here. I can take this a step further if I need to. So that brought in the 4 based on that rule, but there could always be something like, I don't need the mobile one. I have the option to remove this, and it say, do you want to remove this member? And that will now show up as an exclusion. So kind of the same way we had in live maps, where you can turn around and create a rule and add things in there, and then you can exclude things so it doesn't calculate as part of the health. I have the same functionality here. It's all about creating a rule, adding it to the board. Now, if I go into the rules, you can see this is exactly what that one is. I can see what the rule is. If I want to include sub members, I can actually tell it to include the sub members, any of the child relationships that are in there. I can edit this, or I can turn, which also includes the ability to delete this if I need to. You can have multiple rules up and down. It doesn't really matter. And then of course the infrastructure in my case is fairly simple. I was on the rules last, so that's why I popped up there. I have some servers that are on-prem. I've got the one that was from Justin's lab there. I could have easily told it to grab all computers from Justin's Azure, and then it would automatically populate that in. This one, I actually have a component from ServiceNow that allows me to pull in the incidents that those objects may be related to. So that's kind of where the incident information comes from. So this kind of gives you an idea of how to build the service. Now, the one thing as a hybrid service that I would be missing in this scenario is a switch going out, or a firewall going out my network to get to the components. Because obviously when you're talking about a hybrid type of environment, that's a key component, is the networking. How are my on-prem users, are they able to get to the on-cloud or in-cloud stuff? So that's kind of one of those things that I always find is useful in this case. That's a simple service. I did want to do one more thing here. If you look at any particular object, and I'm going to actually just pull up the raw properties, you'll notice that there's a little kind of hover over. The hover over kind of gives you the, the field name, and that's where source.azure.name in this case. If I was to do source.azure.location, the field type is case sensitive. So name has to be lowercase in this case. Location has to be lowercase. When you start getting into something that may have spaces in it, that's where life gets a little more interesting, because you have to actually break out of it. This is an Elasticsearch kind of search feature. There is a KB article on how to do a search, to help you out. Some wildcards, how you can do ranges for IP addresses. If you have to escape out of something, the key is also like source dot, the integration. So what the integration names are, Office 360. Some of them are obviously like Azure is Azure. VMware is slightly different. It's like vCenter or something like that. So some of them are a little different there. Anyway, that's pretty much building a service. It's a matter of adding the components, making sure you have them all together from the different parts of your environment that make sense for that service. Now, you can obviously have multiple services. If you wanted to treat those differently, you could build out here's my cloud environment, here's my on-prem environment, so that those are separate, calculated separate, and you can see them differently. But you can also have the combined service that pulls it all together.
I do find some searches are pretty interesting as well. So one I came across the other day was a customer wanted to see SSL certificates if they're about to expire, and in their monitoring platform they had something that wrote that away as a field. It was PRTG, for example. You could do a field to show a certain value and less or more as well. So you could actually get a search to create a board or a service map. I don't understand why it would work in a service map. Service map's more about static objects, to be honest, even though it can be dynamic. But that result gave him a board that showed when SSL certificates were going to crash in the next 30 days on his systems. So that gave him a really good to-do list, no matter where the data was sitting. And he had, 4 or 5 data sources checking multiple components around the world. And they hadn't even started looking at the stuff in Azure yet, but we could do the same if that field gets denoted somewhere as a field. So you can do those combinations as well. So you can do multiples against IP ranges and stuff like that. When you start going to cloud stuff, you can probably start using more your resource groups, which is something I noticed in Azure could become very useful. So what you might want to think about for your service mapping is making sure your resource groups are set up per application, if possible. I know Microsoft's got different theories around that one, but if you guys can do that, or use the tags in Azure. So all of the cloud stuff uses tag system, and we read the tags field as well. So a scenario that a lot of people are coming up with to automate that service mapping that we do, because service discovery just doesn't work at this level, is potentially to hit a tag that this supports this application, and then you use our search to find the tag and group the components together per tag as well, which makes life a lot easier for you because tags are very simple to run up. It's a field within Azure. So there is a question I usually get at this stage, something we lightly touched on, but where the product is looking in the near future. So without promising anything on our roadmap, because I get my fingers ticked a lot for that one, is potentially, the data that we're storing in IQ not only accumulates the information as a relationship to the service, but you may have saw from Chris that we've got something with that SLA value. Now, right now in the IQ product, that's a very simple box is being read for so much percentage of time over the last 7 days. However, in coming releases, you're going to see that ability to slice and dice that more and to be able to generate report and information around it, which is essentially where we're driving with a lot of this data. So that comes back to the fact that you guys are going to have databases, servers, workloads sitting in multiple subscriptions within Azure or multiple clouds or in potential different locations, grouping them together and then being able to run a report on all of those assets that support the application could potentially drive conversations like, where do we need to invest in the future? Or benchmarking your cloud systems, right? So moving to Azure, was it a good move? Can we look back in 6 months' time and say the availability was better or the service delivery was better? And that's where that slice and dice will come in on the reporting side.
I figured I'd cover the other news parts. So the first thing is the support email address. I knew it was coming. It was just a matter of time. So there is a new support email address. That's itops-support@martellotech.com. Don't worry if you're still using the support@civision.com. It's still in effect. It will continue to be in effect. It hasn't stopped. We don't have any foreseeable plans of stopping it at all. It's just a matter of everything is getting aligned into the Martello Tech family. So there's other support email addresses for the other product lines we have. An important update with PRTG. PRTG updated their API. That was with the latest version, 19.4.54.1506. There is an issue with that because it doesn't parse things correctly in IQ anymore because they changed everything to a string all of a sudden. The fix is obviously on the website now. You can download it. If you do not do this and you're running PRTG and you happen to update to this version, what you will find is that you will get extremely large, massive log files, like 7 gigabyte per day log files, depending on frequency of how long you're updating and things and the number of components you have. That just happens to be the one that we ran into. So we do recommend, if you have PRTG, to download the latest release. By the way, we sent an email out to all the customers that have PRTG. So if you haven't received it, you should have. If you have questions, you can feel free to contact support. We'll see about trying to get you upgraded, try to do it as soon as possible, and go from there. Live Maps Mobile, if you happen to be one of the few that are still using the older app, notifications will stop December 31st. There will be no notifications that will go out after that point. The app can still be used to look at the dashboards that you have, assuming that you're running on an older version of the software. But if you're on Live Maps Portal version 10.4 or greater, then chances are that mobile app doesn't work at all. So if you're still using it and need to use it, please contact support. We'll get you upgraded, get you set up on the newer app, and we'll kind of go from there.
Chris, it might be worthwhile just explaining for those of you who don't know, if you're on the older version, if you're using that separate Windows service, I think it's known Live Maps notification service.
Yeah, Live Maps notification service. By the way, that notification service is no longer needed with the new app. We don't send notifications out that way. We send notifications out through Google Firebase to send notifications to Android and iOS. So it doesn't really matter which one you're using, but that's how notifications are sent out through the portal directly.
For those of you who've already stepped over, you may potentially just want to go back to your Live Map servers and remove that service because it doesn't have to run, to save you guys a bit of monitoring around it as well. But yeah, if you remove it and you notice the service still isn't pushing notifications, reach out to us because that means that your mobile subscribers were set up on it still. And that will stop in January, of course. And you will know about it. But we're trying to preempt that. Make sure you guys are on the latest version. And I don't think you'll be disappointed if you do upgrade your app front end to the latest version anyway, because it is smoother and neater.
All right, last thing, for anyone that's on version 2.7 or greater, in the folder structure of IQ, of where it's installed, which is typically C, program files, Civision IQ, there's a tools folder. In there, there is a PowerShell script. It's called IQ Integration Refresher.ps1. It has a set purpose. I figured I'd explain it to go through that. As people have upgraded and gone through time, we found that on certain cases, we've gotten some orphan data. Basically, that there's data that's directly in Elasticsearch still that doesn't exactly exist anywhere else anymore. So what this does is it basically clears out all of the information for that integration. And by the way, you can select which integration you want to run it on to kind of clean out the Elasticsearch indices for that integration. It'll also go through and clean out some snapshot information. What it doesn't do, and this is the important reason for this, is it doesn't touch SQL at all. So therefore, the SQL side, the discovered component with its GUID and all that other stuff is still safe. It's still there. That means that any of those objects that you have will remain in their boards or their services or anything along those lines. However, for about 10 minutes or so, any of those objects that you have after running the script will probably be gray while we regather the current health state of that information. This is really important. Sometimes, it's not something I recommend that you have to run on your own. It's just I wanted to explain what it was, what its purpose is. Typically, it's something that I'm going to run from support, meaning, okay, it looks like we're at a point where we probably need to run this, especially if you find that you have alerts that don't have a related component to it. It's just something to kind of clean out the works without having to uninstall and reinstall the integration, which is something that we've done in the past to kind of clear things up. So that's what that script's for. If you have any other questions about it, please contact support. We can go from there.
It's been a pleasure doing another session with you, Chris. It's been so long since I've done that.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So I do look forward to the next one. I think this is the last one we've got planned for this year.
Yeah, next time we're going to probably February. We'll have a couple updates in between now and then of different products. Obviously, if there's a particular topic that you would like us to cover a little bit more in depth on one particular thing versus another, you can send us a suggestion. We are always looking for suggestions on topics of how to solve different problems and how we can do different parts, whether it involves live maps. Most of our user groups have been live map centric. This one is obviously a little bit more IQ centric. We're seeing more and more people start to deploy IQ and run it and get it going, especially with different platforms and monitoring involved. So we felt it was kind of a good place to put one in, especially being that this one actually had the ability to pull in cloud services versus just being SCOM related.
And I think if you do spot, what we're doing with the hybrid stuff is that this IQ takes essentially an experience that you're used to in live maps and expands it, but also takes away dependency of SCOM, which gives a lot of people a food for thought of how they're going to readdress their monitoring tool or their monitoring process. So we're definitely open to anything you guys are coming across process-wise that potentially grabbing the data together could make it easy. So some of the focus is next year, which I think the next user group could potentially go over if we don't get any major wild requests, will be how to slice and dice the information on reports so that we can make reporting on what you're monitoring a lot more pleasurable experience for people. Our team will reach out to you about that. I think that's it. All the best. Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks everyone. See you next time.